Salman, first question. Is The Moor's Last Sigh a cathartic autobiography? Because it seems to have an awful lot of you, both as a youngster and in your contemporary self, in the book.
It's not an autobiography, but clearly, like most novels, it does grow to an extent out of my experience. One of the strange things I found is that all the very, very different protagonists of my different books are always described as being autobiographical versions of me. So it is I remember when Midnight's Children came out, and I went to India just after it came out. I went to do a lecture in Bombay, and I heard a voice from the audience, woman's voice, cry out, "But he's got a perfectly ordinary nose." And I thought, what does that mean, to be accused of having a perfectly ordinary nose? And it was quite clear that she expected the narrator of Midnight's Children to walk out on stage and not the author, because of course he does have a perfectly extraordinary nose. What I would say is the relationship between a writer and the point of view character he uses is always ambiguous. And there's obviously an extent to which you feed your own feelings and your own kind of take on the world through that character. But it's only up to a point, you know. I mean, to use the example of much greater writers, Stephen Dedalus is not Joyce. He's very like Joyce. He went to the same school and college as Joyce. He lived in the same part of Dublin as Joyce. He had very similar family relations, but he wasn't Joyce. You know, Marcel is not Proust. I mean, to give only the most obvious example, Proust was homosexual and Marcel, the character of the novel, is heterosexual. But otherwise, they're very like each other. So I would say that in the case of someone like Moor in this novel, he is somebody through whom I've been able to explore certain ideas about loss and exile, if you like. But beyond that, he's not me, no.
And yet, in your current predicament, is it, or was it easier for you to write through the voice of a narrator than to perhaps choose to write in the third person, to be distanced from what you were writing about?
It's always a big decision, that first person and third person. I mean, in the Satanic Verses, for instance, I didn't want it to be a first person narration because I wanted to be able to see these characters sort of from one step away. You know. This time, I mean, it's a family saga. I wanted somebody who was in the middle of the family. Also, the two giant figures in the novel are not the narrator. I mean, the giant figures in the novel are the mother, his mother and father. And I wanted somebody of human scale, if you like, from whom I could look at these larger-than-life characters. And because although he's the narrator, in my view, he's not the central figure of the novel. And the central figure of the novel, insofar as there is one, is his mother, the painter Aurora, who is deliberately made into this gigantic sort of bird of paradise figure who fills and overflows the frame, you know, and who in many ways overpowers and oppresses all her children.
The book does have many overpowering and quite grotesque characters in it, and that seems to have been a trait throughout most of your novels. Do you have an obsession with the grotesque nature of the human condition?
Well, I like things to be slightly larger than life, you know, and I think that's more interesting to me as a writer than to simply make a photograph of life. You know, I mean, I think it's a trick that I certainly picked up from a lot of the great English writers like Dickens and Thackeray, Fielding. You know, all had this gift of taking very closely observed social settings. So if you look at the world of Tom Jones or Vanity Fair or the novels of Dickens, it's fantastically detailed in its observation and completely naturalistic. And then on this screen, so to speak, they project characters, Becky Sharp, for instance, who are slightly larger than life. And I wanted to do something similar, and to take a world, you know, that I think if you went to the Bombay of the novel, you'd find it there. You know, if you went to Cochin, you would find the synagogue with the blue tiles. If you went to the parts of the city which are described in Bombay, you'd find it more or less as described. But against this screen, I like to project slightly bigger than life characters, slightly epic, more than grotesque, epic.
Bombay is the central setting, certainly for the first half of the book, and you describe it as a city of mixed-up mongrel joy, and you describe Moor as Zagoibi, their central character, the Moor, as a Jewholic anonymous, a Cath Jew nut. Those are very evocative uses of words and mixing of words and melting of different descriptions down. Do you view yourself as a kind of composite melting pot of different cultures and ideas?
Yes, absolutely. I've always described myself as a mongrel, really, and I think it's, in my view, much preferable to be a mongrel than to be a pedigree dog. I think it was just the nature of growing up in Bombay. You know, you do find every conceivable kind of culture and attitude all around you as your childhood friends, you know, and so you grow up as a mixture of those things.
And you've always been a great advocate of the potential of cultures and ideas and races to mix.
Yes.
Do you think, given what's happened to you, that there is hope in the world that those kind of cross-fertilizations can successfully happen?
I think they can. I mean, I think obviously there are victories and defeats in that process. I mean, the idea of from which the controlling image of this novel came, the story of the Moor's last sigh, obviously is an example of such a defeat. I mean, that's to say it's a story about the end of a period in Spain in which Christian, Jewish and Muslim culture became a kind of mélange composite culture. And then under the reconquest of let's say the Christian fundamentalist reconquest of Ferdinand and Isabella, that composite culture was destroyed. Now I've always found that composite culture very valuable and interesting, and I thought it had a lot to say about the composite culture of India, which I am more centrally concerned with. And so I used in this novel the failure or the end of that moment in Spain as a way of commenting on what I think of as a danger in contemporary India of a similar kind of rupture.
The book has been banned in Bombay. I don't know if that...
No, it hasn't quite. No, hasn't quite.
It's not been fully banned.
No, it's not been formally banned. There's a kind of... that's to say that the Shiv Sena, the ruling party in Bombay, is not pleased by it.
Did you find that a predictable outcome?
Yes, of course. I mean, because one of the things this novel is most centrally about is to say that the secular democratic vision of India, which was the vision of the founding fathers of the country, it was the vision of Nehru and Gandhi and so on, and that was the India that I grew up in, that version of India is under serious threat because of the growth of extremist nationalist groupings of all sorts, and not only the Shiv Sena, but including the Shiv Sena. So given that is the novel's social view, if you like, it's not exactly surprising that the Shiv Sena dislikes it. They're wrong about one thing, however, that's to say, to make an exact comparison, as they've tried to do, between the figure of the communalist politician, Raman Fielding in my novel, and of the real-life leader of the Shiv Sena, Bal Thackeray, is much too simple. I mean, of course, to an extent, there are echoes. That's to say, both the real-life Thackeray and the fictional Fielding were formerly cartoonists, for example, and they do lead a communalist party in Bombay.
You also deal in the book with the kind of a loony alternative new age ideas that frequently crop up in the press here.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel, in a way, that as we get to the end of the millennium, we are adrift spiritually, religiously?
I'm all in favour of being adrift religiously. Actually, I have to say that in my view, the social effects of too much religion are almost always negative, and I think that's one of the things that I'm talking about in this novel. I do think that if you're talking about the West, I think there is a kind of crisis of value, because there is a problem that happens when religion loses its power. That where else do you get a value system from? You know, I mean, there's a line in the novel that the painter Aurora says about her own work. She says that she's interested in painting religious paintings for people who don't believe in God, and in a sense, I think she is also a painting of that sort herself. That's to say, I also am interested in painting those paintings, by which I mean, I think it's an important function of artists and intellectuals today to try and build a kind of, if you like, a moral vision of the world, which is not dependent on religion for its sanction.
The Moor talks about, I think it's 4 of his own private universes. Does that perhaps link into what you've just said? And in this book, are you revealing your own private universe to us?
Yes, I think that you could say that. I think that would be fair. The thing about Moor is that he's a very privileged child. He's actually more privileged than I was. I mean, I came from a fairly wealthy family. But he comes from a dimension of the super rich, which is an even greater level of privilege in India. And one of the things that I wanted to happen to him in the novel, as were to open his eyes, so to speak, was that he should be removed from that kind of paradise garden, that he should be thrown out of Eden and find himself in the gutter where the rest of the country lives. And so for him, he loses these private worlds. He grows up in a series of fantastically privileged, glittering, walled gardens, if you like, and then is flung into the gutter and has to discover another and much harsher series of truths, both about the country and about himself.
And how have you coped with the restriction that you've had imposed on your life? Because I suppose in a way you've been chucked out of the walled garden and for the time being